Here's an Instagram Live of me interviewing Ryan Nosak, currently the Assistant Director of Sports Performance at DePaul University in Chicago. Ryan and I go way back as our friendship was born in the weight room during college at Penn State University. We covered a ton of topics, including his journey to where he is today, what his job entails, and the honest truth about what it takes to become a strength and conditioning coach. Ryan also gives advice and wisdom for those interested in the field and talks about his relationships with athletes, coaches, and the medical team from his standpoint. All of this along with talking shop about the profession and current events, as well as answering some great live questions that rolled in. Hope you enjoy this one.
The Prehab audio experience will teach you how to take control of your health through knowledge by optimizing performance, promoting longevity, and keeping your movement system in tune. Welcome to your host, the Prehab Guys.
Without further ado, second time, I'd like to welcome Ryan Nosak. He's the Assistant Director of Sports Performance at DePaul University in Chicago. Ryan and I, we went to undergrad together at Penn State University. Ryan, thanks for joining. Thanks for taking the invite.
Craig, thanks a lot, man. I'm really pumped to be on here tonight, and I've been a follower of you guys for a long time, so really honored to be a part of the podcast.
Awesome. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am going into my third year now as the director of sports, as the assistant director of sports performance at DePaul University. I am in charge of all of the track and field teams, women's soccer, men's golf. Prior to DePaul, I was at UNC Charlotte for 2 years as an assistant strength and conditioning coach. I worked with women's basketball and men's tennis during my time there. Prior to Charlotte, I spent a year at Robert Morris University out in Pittsburgh as an assistant strength coach. Prior to Robert Morris, I was a grad assistant at Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee. I also did an internship at Vanderbilt when I was there. And then prior to that was the undergrad days at Penn State, 4 years for undergrad there, and then spent 2 years as an intern working with football, quite a bit of Olympic sports. Really, that's where all the magic began.
Lots of experience. I think that's the one thing that I take away from it. And, you know, as much as you have been following us, I have a personal Instagram as well. I've been following you a bit, and I remember seeing some of your stuff at Vanderbilt. I think that's where we really started connecting and messaging. And it was funny, Ryan and I were talking about this. I reached out to Ryan a long time ago because I wanted him to do some content for us, but you know what? He's taken up this offer, so I'm glad to have him on. So I think one of the first questions that I personally have and that some other people have is, you mentioned now you're the Assistant Director of Sports Performance versus you were strength coaches at multiple different programs. Can you elaborate a little bit about how your role is different compared to being the strength coach versus like a Assistant Director of Sports Performance? Maybe they're pretty similar. Maybe there's some differences. Let's hear about that.
Yeah, I'd say like at most universities, it's probably going to be nuances with the title. Like I think the assistant strength coach at some places is probably going to hold the same value as assistant director at others. I think assistant director is probably going to sound a little bit better on a resume. And I think with assistant director probably comes more administrative roles. At DePaul, I'm also in charge of our internship development program. So mentoring young coaches, creating a curriculum for them. I also take the lead in trying to learn about the sports science side of things. I'm heavily involved with force plates, utilizing a software called ForceDex at DePaul. We also utilize GymAware, velocity-based training. So those are my two realms that I really try to dive into. So I would say probably with the administrative side of things is probably the major differences.
Okay. And I think the most important question is, how does someone get into your position? I mean, you can even go back to Penn State where we used to chat at one of the gyms. I mean, they had the rec center that looked like Globo Gym, right? They had the white building. That's where I always found you, lifting a bunch of weights.
Oh, you know it, man. That was my spot.
But, how does someone get into your position? Tell us a little bit.
Yeah, the strength and conditioning world is a very interesting profession, and it's not something where you can just take one job and immediately expect to climb the ladder and get to the next. Many coaches, probably people who are listening here, have had similar paths of working unpaid for 2 to 3 years as an intern, maybe following a kinesiology or exercise science degree and working in the trenches and then climbing up from there. I mean, I guess the real path, if I would have to classify it, is probably doing something like a kinesiology or exercise science degree at the undergrad level. During that time, trying to intern, that was the biggest thing that I could have done to help my career, was finding mentors at that time. One of them listening right now, Cam Davidson, also had the honor of working for Craig Fitzgerald at Penn State. Those two individuals really took me under their wing, and I started working in the Penn State weight rooms at 19 years old. I remember being a junior, waking up at 4:30 a.m., going to work in the weight room, leaving at 7:30 or 8, going to classes, going back to the weight room in the afternoon. I mean, it was an additional part-time job, as on top of being a full-time student as well. Typically following that, a student might become a graduate assistant at a university where they're able to maybe get their graduate degree paid for while working essentially full-time as a strength coach. Your hours might say you're just working 20 hours, but we all know you're probably working more than 40, probably 50 or 60 hours. And usually with your graduate assistant positions, you aren't working for money. You might just be getting like a small stipend, and then your classes are covered. And then following the graduate degree, it's no guarantee that you're going to get a job. Just because you have a master's degree, that's not really the case. I'll be honest to all the listeners here. It's probably mostly about, it's not who you know, but it's who knows you.
I like that, because that was one of the questions that rolled in. It's, how much is it about who do you know, and what does your resume say? And because people are always asking that, it's not even just related to strength and conditioning, but any job in the world or getting into a school. I really like that. I'm definitely going to be taking that from you. So you mentioned a little bit about, the degree that you would recommend. What about any certifications? You talked a little bit about internships as well. What other experiences would you recommend for someone that wants to get into your shoes?
Yeah, I'd probably say the biggest things are the CSCS degree. That's probably still considered the gold standard in the strength and conditioning world. I've worked as a collegiate strength coach now for, I guess, 8 years. So I think I have what's called the SCCC. That's basically the collegiate version of the CSCS. I have both of those certifications, so the SCC and the CSCS. I would say that if you're going to be working in the collegiate realm, I think the SCCC is a great route to go down. To get that, you have to spend, I believe, I want to say it's around 600 to 800 hours under a master level strength and conditioning coach. So the master level strength coach is probably somebody who might be in the field for like 15 or 20 years. And so you're doing this very specific internship where you're learning from some of the best. And I think that's very practical. Like, anybody can sit down and pass an exam like the CSCS, but that doesn't guarantee you to become a strength and conditioning coach. So with the certification like the SCCC, I think it allows you to be a little more practical.
Yeah, I think that's my biggest pet peeve with the CSCS, because there's a lot of physical therapy students, especially when I was in school, my classmates, they were like, hey, should I take the CSCS? Is it going to make me stand out? It's a written test, and I've never heard of it's the SCCC, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with it, but the fact that it requires hours, that's what I'm always referring students to. That's what I'm always referring aspiring strength and conditioning coaches too is getting experience. I think the experience is more valuable than reading any textbook.
Yes, I would say that is the biggest thing to become a collegiate level, professional level, or just, I think, a strength and conditioning coach at any level. It's going to be about the experience. I think with information is not a problem. Okay, one of the questions that just rolled in: who mentored you for your SCCC? Craig Fitzgerald at Penn State. He's now the head strength coach at University of Tennessee. He was a great guy to be able to learn from. I consider him to be one of the best. If you have the chance to go and learn from a mentor for your SCCC, I'd highly recommend it. But I think just progressing at any level, whether it's to become a director, whether it's to become an assistant director, you learn by being in the trenches. It's not about being in the library and reading the books. Yes, as a strength coach, you do need to read, but no book is going to prepare you for when your athletes come rolling in after a practice where you had 90% scheduled on the bar that day, and you're like, oh boy, what am I about to do here? That's when your people skills, that's when your logical thinking skills come in, and that really comes from being able to think on your feet and work from being a coach.
Yeah, it really comes down to experience. So I can imagine trying to gain experience in some of the Big 5 schools, Big 10, Big 12, SEC, you name it. These are the ones that sort of they get the highlights. That's where the spotlight is, but it's not easy to get your foot into the door. I'm sure there's people that reach out to you all the time as well that want to observe you or observe coaches at DePaul. So if someone doesn't have that opportunity, where would you suggest someone starting? I mean, are high schools a good place to start? Are there some other avenues for someone that maybe they're unsure if they want to be a strength and conditioning coach and they just need to get exposure to help making that decision? What would you recommend?
That's a great question. I think it's going to depend on what that individual wants. So just because somebody is a coach at a Power 5 university or a coach at the professional level doesn't necessarily mean that they're a great coach. Okay. And I think that's something that people need to realize. There are great coaches at the high school level. There are great coaches at the Division II, Division III, Division I. It's not about the logo on your chest. I think if somebody wants to go in the collegiate setting, they should probably go and learn from a collegiate strength coach to help start bridging the gap with networking there and realizing the role of a collegiate strength and conditioning coach. I think the roles are going to differ between the collegiate setting, the professional setting, and the high school setting. Ultimately, though, like let's say that you're in an area where maybe you don't have a college strength coach at a university, but you have high schools nearby. I think that's great. The high school strength and conditioning setting is really growing over the past 5-10 years. And I think there are many reputable coaches at that level. And that's an entirely different realm than the collegiate setting, right? You're bringing athletes in who are 14, 15, 16. That's a lot different training them than you're with me. I have it easy at the Division I setting, I think high school is really where the true magic happens.
Yeah, and someone brought up this question, and I loved it. I can't wait to hear it from you. I hope I wrote it down. But it's, how do you look after every athlete's technique if the coach-to-athlete ratio is not in your favor? And then immediately I thought of this question after you brought up the teenage thing, because teenagers, growth spurts, they could get blown over by a strong gust of wind. I see it in the clinic all the time. And you mentioned you may have it a little bit easier with some of these highly skilled athletes. They know their body, they know how to move. But yeah, could you elaborate on that question?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that you need to do as a coach is never stop moving. So your vantage point is going to matter a lot. So if you're in the side of a room, back of a room, corner of a room, you're not probably going to be able to see everything. So what I was taught as an intern is to never stop moving. If you were to put a GPS tracker on me, you would see figure eights all up and down the room. Okay, so I consistently move and I work the room, so I'm able to see things. Some things that have helped for me in the past is to put exercises on a cadence or a tempo. maybe blow a whistle. Hey, where everybody's starting set one at the same time. Unrack your bar, step back, go. And that was something I did a lot at Charlotte with my women's basketball athletes, especially when teaching them cleans for the first time. We would do cleans on a cadence. Cam, I stole that from you at Penn State. And that was a really good tool to be able to see everybody at the same time. Other things that we've done as well has been video feedback, which can help and it can hinder a session. You know, I'm not one who videotapes everything and puts it on social media. I think there's value in that, but I think it can be a distraction to the session sometimes. But I personally try to debrief my training sessions. So at the end of my training sessions, I'll write down what I saw, things that we need to work on, and then for next session, I have a plan to attack that.
I like it. That's cool. So I think now is the time for our shameless plug. Any program or schools that you'd recommend to maybe earn your undergrad degree, or any programs that you'd recommend for certifications? I mean, I'm wearing the t-shirt, so let's face it. We'd all recommend Penn State, but
we are
recommending it.
We are, yeah.
At the same time, you've been in the field now for, let's say, 6 years or so?
Probably eight, including my internship experience.
Yeah. Being in the field and knowing what you know now, are there other programs that you would recommend? I mean, are there other routes that you would recommend that you haven't touched on already?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you want to go to some place that maybe has an exercise science or a kinesiology program. So with the CSCS, they're actually going to be changing some of the requirements. I think by 2030, I want to say, don't quote me on that, maybe it's 2025. At that point, you're going to have kinesiology or exercise science as a bachelor's degree to be able to take the exam. So I don't want to get into the very details of which schools. Penn State really helped me out quite a bit. Obviously, in the kinesiology department, we had people like Dr. Zatsiorsky. He's a guy that people talk about all the time. And for us to be able to learn from a guy like that, that's huge. But I think programs that offer kinesiology or exercise science can be a great route. And then I think it matters in what you're doing with that experience. Okay, so if you're at a university where maybe it doesn't have the best exercise science department, well, it's up to you to go out of your own way and learn more. Best way to do that is go learn from your strength coaches at your university. Those are the ones who are in the trenches, and they're going to be able to tell you exactly what to do. And I have so many friends who tell me that their undergrad experiences were not the best, but how they improved that was by actually going and working in the weight room.
Yeah, and you've talked a lot about having the grind, right? I mean, sounds like you were much more disciplined than I was in undergrad, and I'll be very transparent here. I feel like that's probably why I saw you at the weight room all the time, is because you basically lived and worked there.
Basically, yeah.
You've also talked about, what you value the most, but I haven't asked you this question formally. What have you valued the most so far that has helped you with your career to get you where you are today? You've already talked about some people and some experiences, but maybe something that the audience can sort of build off of and be like, okay, I need to focus on that.
I'd say ultimately it's the relationships that you're going to create and the impact that you're going to have every single day. You never know what somebody can be going through in their life. And maybe you're that one positive source that they need just to get through their day. And something I heard a long time ago that stuck with me now has been, never underestimate the impact you can have on another person. You make an impact on that one person, it causes like a wave-like ripple effect. That person goes out, makes an impact on another person, and that person goes off, and it's just like a domino effect, right? So I think no matter what is going on outside of, in your personal life, don't bring it to the professional setting. Always aim to be a positive source to your athletes, to your clients, whoever you're working with.
And I think that goes for both professions, right? I mean, you're working with athletes in the weight room, on the field, on a daily basis. Same thing goes with patients. I mean, sometimes you have to, because there's things going on in your life, there's things going on in that person's life, but they're coming for you to help. I mean, you're there designing programs for these individuals, or I'm there trying to help this person deal with X, Y, and Z. It's just showing up and putting the work in every single day. So I think that's great. Let's see. We haven't really talked about this, and I'm looking forward to getting your definition and to just hear it from you. What is a strength coach? What does it take to be a strength coach? And, tell us a little bit about your daily life. Maybe what you do now at DePaul is a little bit different. You've talked a little bit about the administrative work, but currently what you're doing now compared to maybe the past 8 years, tell us a little bit. Shed some light on the profession.
Yes. I think talking about maybe the daily requirements of the job, I'm going to say that you have to be like Thomas Edison, okay? You can't just be this guy who writes a training program and think that's all it is, okay? There's a lot to being a strength coach. It's not just putting a workout on a piece of paper and handing it to somebody. As a coach, as a strength coach, you need to be an incredible motivator, always bring in energy and intensity to your training sessions. You need to be a great problem solver, because you're going to face problems on a daily basis that happen in a matter of 5 seconds. I alluded to an example before where athletes come in after a practice and they've been crushed by their sport coaches, and you have to be able to adapt on the fly. It's really important to have a wide background of intelligence, not just in strength and conditioning. Strength and conditioning is extremely important. Within the realm of strength and conditioning, obviously you need to know about strength. You need to know about conditioning, speed training, mobility, flexibility, nutrition, recovery aspects, every one of those things. But you don't want to forget that you're also in a people profession. So most importantly, you need to know how to interact with people. So typically for myself, I try to read about maybe 2 books outside of the strength and conditioning field for every 1 book that I'm reading inside the field. These books outside the field will be things like psychology, sociology, history, biographies of individuals, because that helps me interact with the human that's in front of me better.
What's something that you've read recently? I know you've been posting stuff.
I just read a book called Talk Like Ted, and it's about how to become a better public speaker. And if you're in any profession, I'd highly recommend that book. And as strength coaches, that's another thing that you're going to be doing every single day. You're going to be getting in front of athletes or administrators, and you're basically going to be public speaking. So you need to be a good communicator. Going back to those daily tasks there, I think another important part of the job that people may not realize is those interactions that occur on a daily basis with an administrator, with a sport coach. So obviously an athlete is a big part of it, but usually the athletes are pretty easy. Okay, the athletes usually want to get better. You have to learn how to interact with that person, but I think most strength coaches probably face the biggest battles up the chain with administrators or sport coaches. So I think that's another way of being Thomas Edison where it comes in. If you're just a guy who sits in the weight room all day and squats all day and never gets out of that weight room, number one, nobody's going to know who you are. Number two, people are probably going to be pretty afraid of you because they think that you just live in this dungeon. And then 3, they may not trust you because they don't know you. So talking to people is probably one of the most important qualities that you need to have. And then, I'm going into all this background stuff, but a big part of my day is the time that I get to spend with my athletes. On a typical day, it's for me right now, I'm slowing down, but in my busiest time, it's probably a typical day of between 4 to 7 coaching sessions, probably about an hour long. I'm leading the athletes through those sessions, coaching them. All my groups are team-based, so I typically have no less than 10 people in there at one time. But it's exciting because I work with a wide variety of sports. I'm not experiencing the same thing over and over. And then again, that forces me to become a better strength coach because I'm not just working with the same sport all the time. I'm being forced to work with cross country, then my throwers come in, then my sprinters come in, then women's soccer. And all those realms are totally different. So you need to be prepared for how you interact with those individuals and how you design and coach their training programs.
With that being said, regardless of the sport, what is your go-to fire-up song?
Oh, man. I think my buddy Andrew Coleman's listening right now. Man, he got me. I guess he probably got me into Motley Crue a few summers ago. We were at Charlotte, and we were like squatting at like 5 a.m. in the morning. And Kickstart My Heart by Motley Crue really got me fired up.
I'm going to check that out after this call.
Oh,
or
man,
I'm going to keep it for
it.
when I want to lift heavy.
Yeah, man, that's like my go-to squat song now too.
So where do you think the profession's going? I mean, is it going to change much? How do you see the role of the strength coach either spreading or sort of, narrowing in on a certain thing? I'd love to hear what you think of that.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think the role of the strength coach is consistently evolving. And it's really one thing that you need to be able to do as well, adapt or die. I'll talk about a few different routes here that I'm currently seeing. I think the sports science realm is probably one of the biggest that people probably know about at this point. But sports science in terms of internal load monitoring, which would be things like maybe measuring a person's heart rate, their work output during a session, external load monitoring, maybe how much they're actually running, such as like GPS tracking during a game. Like I mentioned before, like I'm doing testing with force plates at DePaul. So I'm basically consistently measuring jumps in our athletes, and we're doing something called an isometric mid-thigh pull. So we're really trying to bridge the gap with objective-based testing. So much of what we do is subjective. It's important that you have a coach's eye, but to really audit your program to make sure that you know what it's supposed to be doing and to consistently track progress, I think it's important that you do have some objective measures. And sports science is a great way to do that. I think some other things that I'm seeing as well are the way strength coaches now are moving into administrative roles. Some coaches are becoming athletic directors, or they're becoming assistant athletic directors at universities. And I think that's a great thing for strength coaches, because it's a problem that we see sometimes is that in the strength and conditioning world of the collegiate setting, we're managed by people who may not have any idea of what strength and conditioning is like or how we do our jobs. So when we have strength and conditioning coaches move into those higher up administrative roles, it really allows everything below the chain to function more smoothly. Now I think our jobs can be quantified more objectively, which is a really important part about it. But I'll be frank with you. I don't think in the strength and conditioning world, there's really a great way to evaluate how a strength and conditioning coach is doing their job. And I think that's something that people are consistently trying to develop. Maybe sports science will help get you there. You don't want injuries to be that source. If a coach comes in and they take over a program and they say that, oh yeah, we reduced the injury rate. Well, guess what happens when the injury rate goes up? I guess that's going to be your fault then too, huh? So that's kind of a slippery slope that you don't want to get yourself into.
Yeah, I mean, a big thing is player availability, right? But that's not just on the strength coach. I mean, there's multiple factors when it comes to that.
Yeah, player availability is really important, but it's also of a team-based effort. So the strength coach interacting with the athletic trainer and the physical therapist and the sport coach. I think that's the biggest thing, is that sometimes people have always talked about silos, and I think the silos of training, like a strength coach would just be in his own world, and the athletic trainer was just in his or her own world. But I think that's starting to cross paths better, where those silos are getting knocked down. So people are working together, and they're really bridging the gap between whether it's athletic training and sports performance. Just those different worlds in general, because ultimately everyone involved wants what's best for the athlete. But when we let egos get in the way, that's when progress gets halted. And that's probably what happened in the strength and conditioning profession and those other professions for quite some time.
Yeah. I was just going to say it's egos that really bring groups down. And I mean, the minute that you can drop an ego and you can work together, you can really start to learn from one another. I want to answer this question just because I know this person's been patiently waiting. Any other books that helped you with your great relationships with people?
Recently, I read Principles by Ray Dalio. That's a little bit longer of a book. I think it's like 550 pages, but that book in general was a game changer for me in strength and conditioning. I really liked a lot of the concepts in there, and I've brought them into the strength and conditioning world. I think Brett Bartholomew's book, Conscious Coaching, is very applicable to the strength and conditioning coach because it was written for strength coaches. And I think that helps you understand people a little bit better. There was a book I read quite some time ago. It was called Introducing NLP. NLP is basically a form of psychology. And I think it kind of helps you understand like how people act, why they act that way, just their overall backgrounds in general. And I think that's an important part, is that you need to understand that not everybody's going to be the same that you interact with on a daily basis. How can you adapt to speak to different people, different athletes, different clients?
Yeah, doesn't matter how much you know, what you know. If you can't vibe with people, if you can't connect with someone on a personal level, it's really hard for them to buy into whatever it is that you're saying. I want to go back to one last thing that you mentioned when you came into the internal workload versus the external workload. I would love to hear what you think is going to be the future, maybe what you're using at DePaul now. And then I think someone brought up a good point was, I'm sure you're following the NBA playoffs, but, getting strength coaches and some of these people that actually understand the business and the nature of sports. A couple of weeks ago, Portland Trailblazers, Denver Nuggets goes into like 4 overtimes. And you understand now the internal workload, the external workload, significantly higher. It makes me wonder and question, in a decade or so, could the outcome of games like that actually end up changing schedules if we're monitoring these players' workloads even closer, understanding how it could impact injury rates or performance? I would just love to hear your opinion on all of that.
Yeah, I actually had the privilege of attending the NBSCA summit this past weekend, and that's basically the NBA Strength and Conditioning Coaches Conference. It was held here in Chicago, and that was one of the biggest things that they had talked about. And obviously in the NBA, player availability is a key aspect of any organization. And some of the things that they had talked about is there's no way that you can really prepare for the demands of the game. So and you don't really want to in your training either, okay? What I mean by that is that the training from a game, the effects of a game are so high, okay, that it's going to take a lot to recover from that. You don't want to try and go and replicate that in your training. What we're finding now with the sports science is that we probably need to be training at a percentage of that. I don't want to throw random numbers out there, but for the sake of this podcast, maybe let's call it okay that, in practice, we need to hit 90% of our effort in the game. So what coaches are starting to do now is that they're able to really outline their practice schedules based off what they're seeing in games, so that they purposely have high training load demands of practices and extremely low demands of practices. So they might have this wave-like pattern where they have a high day, a medium day, a low day, and it comes back up and around, okay? We don't want to see stagnation with practices. I think probably what listeners have experienced with themselves with athletics is that a lot of times with coaches, every practice looks the same, or every practice they're going to be running their athletes into the ground. That stagnation, it actually creates monotony in the athletes. The more monotony that an athlete accrues, there's probably going to be a greater likelihood of injury, but that's also going to decrease the chance to adapt as well. So we want to see an undulation of practices. I think that's probably something that's really brought that to sport coaches' eyes, is through the means of heart rate tracking, or even GPS. An example here that I can give you is, let's say in a collegiate soccer game, an athlete is running 10,000 meters, we'll call it. They're doing like a 10K. In practice, they probably don't want to be doing a 10K. When they're warming up for that game, they probably don't want to be doing like a 2K, because that's about 20% of the load that they're experiencing. So using like this data from whether it's GPS or these heart rate monitoring tracking devices, I think it allows people to schedule practices better, which ultimately are going to be able to help an athlete stay healthier over the course of a long term, especially in the summer. If an athlete is starting a season in August, they need to make sure that they're coming in June and July, and they're experiencing a load that's going to prepare them for August, but a load that's not going to destroy them as well. If they know that their highest load is probably going to be occurring in August or September, they probably don't want to be experiencing that load in July or June, because then they're adding another whole month of high load onto that plan. So, I mean, I think that's probably going to be one of the biggest things that we see moving forward. I don't know what devices, honestly. I haven't had GPS myself. I've had heart rate. At DePaul, we use ForceDex, force plate platforms. Force plates have allowed us to indicate when athletes are becoming fatigued. We're kind of new to that side of things, so I don't want to get too deep into that. But we've mostly been using force plates to help understand asymmetries of athletes and also audit what our training is doing. So just give us an objective measure into what the last 3 or 4 weeks of training has been doing, and then what qualities we should be attacking after that testing.
There's a really good question that rolled in, and I think we can wrap up after this, but we haven't talked about this either. And it's from Lark Knight. What is your experience with physical therapy on a college campus, and what advice would you give the different disciplines to all coincide under the same roof? I think what I would like to hear you chat about is where does your role fit in terms of communicating with the sports coach, with the medical team, if the player is managing an injury, and are there any other team members that you typically communicate with throughout the year, or maybe more so during the off season or in season? I would love to hear about it.
In my position at DePaul, we are lucky to have 2 full-time physical therapists who are on campus every single day. I haven't experienced that at other universities. They've been more like part-time physical therapists who have come in. So the fact that we have the full-time physical therapist has been a great addition to our staff, and they really are an extension of our staff. I would say all parties involved would be like the strength and conditioning coach, the athletic trainer, the physical therapist, and then the sports coach. Within each of those realms, it's really going to come down to the timeline, the severity of the injury, and then really what point of the year that is. So if there's an injury that occurs, the athlete might first begin working with the athletic trainer just to work on rehabbing essentially. And then if everything goes well, they're showing signs of progress, they're back in the weight room with me. They never leave the weight room if they have an injury. Like let's say it's a lower body injury. Well, we're still going to be training upper body, or we're going to be training abs, or we're going to be training around that lower body injury. But they may be working with the athletic trainer to help rehab that. Now, when the injury becomes more severe, they're going to be with the physical therapist for the majority of maybe like, let's call it the first 2 to 3 months. During that time, though, they may be back in the weight room with me again, working on something that they can work on. Ultimately, I think the people who are making the decisions to play, it's usually a joint effort. We talk about that amongst ourselves. I think for anybody, if you can have a return to play protocol that you create as a staff that has certain requirements for you to hit, I think it allows the return to play process to be smoother. The last thing that you want to do is when an athlete's recovering from an injury, have them work with the physical therapist, send them back to the strength coach, but then they never get experience of the load that they're going to be experiencing on a court, on a field, or the track. So that's something that I think all minds need to sit down in the room and put that together. Like this past year, I had to do that with our track coaches, and I had to do it with a jumper. I don't understand the 100% the demands that a jumper faces at practice every week, but I understand how load monitoring should be increased, and our physical therapists understand that as well. So we had a great conversation with our head track coach where we said, hey, like we think we might need to be at 40% of the intended volume in this week. Maybe next week we'll look back at it and maybe we're looking at 60% of the volume. And then maybe in week 3 we reevaluate and maybe you're at 80% of the volume. Now that's a very broad example right there, but I think that's probably the most important thing is that all parties are getting involved to put that return to play program together.
And I think you brought up some of the objective measurements that you're doing using force plates. I mean, getting all this baseline data, that's awesome stuff to refer back to for an athlete if they ever get injured. Well, hey, these are benchmarks. This is where you were before you were injured. And I think that's where the benefit of being an athlete and rehabbing at your college, I mean, you just have more resources to work with. But you brought up good points, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff that you do in rehab, especially early on, it's very low threshold compared to the intensity and the training volume that they have to get back to doing. So being able to bridge that gap, having a physical therapist being able to communicate with you, the two of you collaborating with the athletic trainer, with the sports coach, you name it, it's just all building that threshold. So that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that you guys are taking care of your athletes well. All right, well, let's wrap it up. I want to hear, what is the advice that you would give to anyone that sort of wants to be a college strength coach? Any parting words other than we are Penn State? I mean, you guys throw one of those in there, but however you want to wrap it up, you take the stage.
Yeah, I'm going to share a few things here that I think have helped me out in my career, and probably circling back to some things I've already mentioned about, but I'll just briefly touch upon them again. Never stop learning. I think that's when coaches start getting into slippery slopes because they're not advancing and they're not able to help their athletes at that point. I'm a believer of the term Kaizen, which is continuous improvement on a daily basis. So whether that's 10 minutes or 10 pages a day, I'm trying to read, devote personal learning time for myself. That's going to become, I think, one of the greatest tools to have in your toolbox, to never stop learning. I think what we talked about with the grind of strength and conditioning, I don't really want to call it a grind, but in a way that it is. I think people probably who are going to be listening to this are people who may have been trying to get a job in the field, and maybe they haven't had luck with that. And I'm going to be brutally honest. It's a very tough field. I've heard people call it before the best job and the worst profession. I think Mark Watts said that before. And I've equated this profession to almost becoming like an actor or a movie star. It's difficult to get noticed. It's difficult to land that job. I've been fortunate to have great mentors and people that have helped guided me along the way. I think for the listeners out there who may be discouraged or may have trouble finding those jobs, just be realistic with what you want in the profession. The collegiate jobs are hard to come by. The professional jobs are hard to come by, but you can be a great coach at the private setting, at the private sector setting. You can be a great coach in the high school setting. I have a friend in Chicago here who's a strength coach, but he's basically a personal trainer, and he is awesome at that job. Coaching is coaching. It doesn't matter where you're doing it at. I think the craft is what matters the most and the impact that you have on people. So don't get discouraged if that's the case. Realize that there may be another path for you out there. You just have to find it. And it's going to take some discipline. It's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take long hours. It's probably going to take low pay along the way. But if this is what you want, you got to keep working. And then when you get it, you get that first job, it's going to be the best day of your life.
And then you're going to keep working.
And then you're going to keep working. You're going to keep learning it too.
Yeah, that's right. But it's all about quality of life. That's what it really comes down to. And if you're super passionate, you want to do this, I don't think it really matters what level you do it at. You're going to enjoy your job and you're going to work hard. I love when people use that saying, like, you'll never work a day in your life. when you are working in this field, anything where it's taking care of people, healthcare related, you work your ass off, but it's so rewarding, so hey man, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this. Sounds like you had a handful of fans in here, and I love it.
I know. Thanks for the shout out, everybody.
That's good. It means that you're a good coach.
Oh,
all right, Ryan, I really enjoyed this one. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. You'll be able to catch this on our podcast. And then Ryan, last but not least, how can people get into contact with you?
I'm happy to answer any questions. If people want to contact me on social media, this is my handle, RNOSAK. I'm on Twitter. I don't really use it a whole lot, but if anybody wants to send me a email, I'm happily going to answer any questions that anybody has. My email is rnosak@gmail.com.
Cool. And then I'll include all of this stuff in the podcast.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks to everyone that tuned in. Catch you next time.
Thanks a lot, man.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening to this podcast with Ryan and I. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Let us know if there are any other topics you're interested in us covering. If you haven't seen our new website yet, you have to check it out. We have some new features, including the body map that makes it very easy to find exactly what you're looking for. Thanks for tuning in.